Dana Denha here, and this is Let's Watch with the Ann Arbor Film Festival. Historically, movies and television tend to repeat the same material decade after decade, leaving many to ponder why there aren't fresh, creative ideas. The Ann Arbor Film Festival is a place to find those one-of-a-kind ideas with art from all over the world in one place. Joining me is Vera Brunner-Sung. With strong ties to the area and the film festival, who uses her own sense of belonging as a recurring theme in her works. Welcome to the show, Vera.
Thanks, Dana.
Let's start with, what got you into filmmaking? What made you want to go to school and learn about filmmaking?
I was someone who started to come around to the idea of filmmaking as something exciting and interesting towards the end of college. And then, graduated and was like, wait, how do I get more into this? And luckily, in my hometown, there's this incredible festival that I really first got to know once I was graduated and moved home. And so I was able to connect with the festival, and really, it blew my mind open of like what was possible in cinema. And for a long time, what had seemed so out of reach, like how could I become a filmmaker? I realized like, oh, people can make films. Anyone can make a film with, you don't need to have a huge amount of money or a huge amount of resources to make something compelling.
What happens next? You interned at the Ann Arbor Film Festival?
I interned, I kind of worked my way in over a few years. And then I decided I wanted to get a graduate degree. I wanted to get an MFA to have the opportunity to really spend some protected time studying and experimenting and figuring out maybe what my voice might be. And I learned about the sort of the various graduate programs that might be a good fit for me by kind of watching the work of the faculty, which was often shown at the festival. So I think it was 2003, maybe, that the festival showed the California trilogy by James Benning. And it was amazing. I was so excited. I think I need to go there and learn from him. And, ultimately, thankfully that worked out. I moved to California. I studied with him as well as a number of other incredible faculty there. And, I graduated 3 years later with more of a sense of, my identity as a filmmaker. But I would say that was definitely not the end of the road. And I've been kind of exploring and learning more about, what really interests me since then.
Talk about that idea of like what really interests you and why that's so important to bring to your art. And it makes you a more well-rounded artist in a way.
On a really basic level, it's probably easier not to be an artist. It's probably easier not to make films than to make them. And so to really have a clear sense of your mission and your like what you want to say and why, I think it requires some connection with your identity and, the basics of like, who you are in the world. And of course that understanding evolves too, but to be connected with that it's what helps me keep going. Why, I know that I need to make films, but why, and what am I trying to say? To be negotiating that as a part of the creative process is important.
You talk a lot about in your work, your connection to the world. Talk about your parents and living in Ann Arbor and how that all affected your senses as an artist.
Yeah, so my parents met in graduate school at U of M and had me. My dad is from Korea and my mother's from Switzerland. And, I'm an only child. And so I grew up with, very much a part of like the wonderful town community and, school community and my parents' social circles and everything. But at the same time, there was always this a certain sense of isolation, like, as an only child, as a child of parents who lived far from extended family. So, that, was sort of important to kind of shaping my sense of self and, my connection with the world and communities. And and then also feeling, as a mixed race person, like, where do I belong, and you're kind of gauging that, right, based on how people interact with you. and then, visiting the home countries of my parents and having to kind of navigate that all over again. And, both of my parents are native speakers of other languages than English, but, they both speak multiple languages. So I had this kind of perspective, this sort of international perspective, and very much like kind of an outsider sensibility in terms of relationship to American culture. And even, Ann Arbor is a very, progressive place socially and culturally, but still it's an American college town. So all of those things were starting to kind of percolate for me. And I don't know that I really reckoned with them until I started making films, really, and thinking about what did I really want to say, and what was my sort of unique perspective on where I grew up and how I see the world. And my first film was actually a portrait of the street that I grew up on. I used that to apply to graduate school. I just went door to door and interviewed all of my neighbors to try to understand, other people's perspectives on our neighborhood and our street. And so that was, a connection to documentary as well as experimental that's followed me into my practice today.
Talk about all the different genres that you try to tackle in your film and how they're different in different ways for you, but also it's a way you can tell a story, the specific story that you want to tell.
Yeah, I think, in the beginning, my first connection, my first love for cinema was narrative film, like for most of us, right? That's a kind of our entry point and what we know. And then, as I mentioned, connecting with the festival and seeing experimental work really for the first time was like, oh, wait, you don't have to tell a story or use actors to do something with film and create meaning, So I stayed away from narrative for a long time for that reason. As far as narrative fiction as a mode of production, right? Not interested in quote unquote storytelling or the, narrative structure. And I went to this graduate program to really focus on documentary and experimental modes. And then, a few years later, I think it's still, even though I said I wasn't interested, it was always there because you're always watching, whether it's on TV or movies in the theater, you're always still sort of absorbing narrative. And when I moved to Montana in 2011, left Los Angeles and moved to Montana, I had this moment of okay, this is a turning point. Suddenly my life has changed. Time is different up here. It's a new community. I had all this space to really think about, well, what would I like to try? And then I thought, maybe I'll try to tell a story in a movie. My first feature, which was a very experimental narrative, but gave me this kind of canvas to explore these themes related to identity and connection with place on a new scale in a different way that I realized after making it that I was really excited about and wanted to keep pursuing. So here I am years later, embarking on a second feature film, really, engaged with screenwriting, really interested in actors, and still kind of bringing this semi-outsider perspective to storytelling, but embracing some of the basic conventions of it a bit more. So I guess that is something a bit I've worked across these different forms in filmmaking, but they really kind of feed one another. And I like to keep up my experimental. It's just to know that I could always make something is very empowering. I don't need to wait around for funding to make something. I just, and not every idea that I have needs a bunch of money or needs a lot of, crew or anything like that. So yeah,
I'm sure when you make the narratives, they probably need a little bit, you need different stuff to make a narrative. When you go make a documentary, you can just, like you said, walk outside, go to your neighbor's house and
right.
sort of create that story yourself. Talk about intertwining these sort of genres to make things experimental. What makes something experimental for you?
I have to go back to something I heard. There was a discussion, I think it was when I was in grad school, and one of my classmates gave this answer. And I think it's the best answer that I've heard, which is just like anything that challenges your idea of what a movie is supposed to be. And I mean, it's a pretty good definition, but I think if you're like a hardcore experimental film person, that no longer applies. But I think anything that sort of subverts or plays with or defies the conventions of the industry or a narrative, or these sort of dominant forms that often we don't even notice them because we're so accustomed to them. And of course, there's a long tradition of avant-garde film around the world and in this country. And so I think being in kind of conversation with that history is also, and those traditions is also, at this point. Of course, I have to like say something about film history because I, teach film, and that's important too. But
for sure.
Anyway,
I mean,
go ahead.
I mean, as a film student myself, that's a big part of learning about filmmaking, is learning about the history of filmmaking, for sure. Talk about your writing and how it's like an outlet for you and how it shapes everything that you're sort of making, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think my writing and my teaching are important parts of my filmmaking practice. It's like another place. Writing is another place to kind of to learn from other people, other like filmmakers. And I love. I haven't done this in a bit, but I used to do this a bit more. Is like going to festivals and writing festival reports because, writing is just a way to engage more deeply with what you're watching. So. And the same thing with teaching, to have to like process your thoughts and transmit them to other people, and sort of like the questions that you pose, and really kind of like thinking deeply about why we do things a certain way, or what the expectations are around a certain aspect of film production. It just helps me kind of develop what I'm doing and why I'm doing it.
When I was able to look at your website and see some of your different clips from some of your works, I feel like you find these people that are like you, where they're like looking for this sense of belonging, or like creating their belonging. Talk about how you connect and find these people, and it really comes along with how you feel as a person.
Yeah, I think, when you say that, I think of two people. One is Doho Suh, the Korean artist who I made two films, a short film, and co-directed a feature documentary about him and his work, as well as my more recent short, which we can talk about later. But I mean, Doho is someone who I met many years ago, and we stayed friends because of this, shared, sympathetic outlook on the world and our own experiences. So, when that opportunity came up to make a film together, it felt like a good, exciting connection, and there was a lot of trust there because the relationship, but also because of our shared creative interests. So
a project like this,
and I'm sure everyone sort of feels that sometime, but it's also like that vulnerability of being able to talk about it too.
Yeah, it's you feel like you're in. I'm all about creating that like kind of safe space, but when you're asking people to be on camera and share personal things too, it's there.
So this year, for the 60th Ann Arbor Film Festival, you're actually doing a project, an intern project, bringing back your old school intern days. Tell us a little bit about it and what we can expect to see this year.
Yeah, I mean, there was this opportunity to do some like curating, and I think because of the place that the festival holds in my I don't want to say career, in my sort of like creative history in a way, like my identity. I just thought it would be really fun to see if there was anyone else out there who felt that way. And I sort of do know, because of the moment when I was there, I know people who I was, alongside. There were interns who I know are still involved in filmmaking. But I was kind of curious to see like, what are people up to, because it was such a formative time for me. And thankfully, the festival has a really good record of all their interns over decades. And, we were able to kind of put together a list of people. And and so I'm excited to kind of show this work together. And, it's a good work. It's and some of it has been shown at the festival, independent of this in the past.
Well, let's watch the trailer for Vera's film, Character.
I'm kind of neutral looking, neither like really handsome, nor am I really horrible to look at. Hey, you! Get away from my car! Whenever I'm ready. We're behaving for the benefit of other people. And if you get aggressive about that, you start manufacturing yourself for other people.
We're back with Vera Brunner-Sung. Why don't you discuss working with Mark Metcalf, who I think a lot of us know through his film career, and how this project came about?
This was like a serendipitous kind of thing. I mean, the connection with Mark, I'd been thinking about making a film about an actor for a while. I think probably since I finished my first feature and became very, I guess intrigued might be the right word, by the audition process. Having auditioned people for my film and never having encountered that experience before, being on the other side of the table from this person who's really just putting themselves out there and being vulnerable, and so often getting rejected, right? I think every artist, vast majority of artists have a lot of experience with rejection, but there's something about an actor's experience of rejection. I think it's so personal because it's not just about like their work or their craft, but it's them, right? It's physically their body, their face, right? The way they move and all of that. So I was just curious, like, what toll does that start to take on people, right? And I was also interested in how, perceptions of a person based on their appearance, start to affect them, inside, as well as like, how we see them, how their career unfolds, right? So kind of some basic things about an actor's experience of their profession. But I just, I think that's kind of a thing about how I like to start a documentary project as real, just, or any film, but it's like with questions. So I want some answers here. But it's more of an exploration than a like let's sit down and I'm gonna pull this out of you. As far as like the end result. So anyways, Mark happened to have a friend in common, and he had just moved to Columbus, where I live in Ohio. And so I looked him up. I thought, oh, well, he's an actor with some experience, and it seems like he has some experience with being typecast. So he kind of, I guess fell into my lap in that sense. Thankfully, when I sort of sprung the idea on him, he was game. And so that sort of started a series of interviews that we did, but they were off camera. They were just voice audio interviews, which I then, used to kind of shape a rough script for the film.
Well, talk about, putting yourself out there. I'm sure you had to be nervous about reaching out to this Hollywood actor. Like I said, we all know him. We know his face. We might not know, everyone might not know his name, but we all know his face. You know what I mean? Right. And that has to be sort of scary to do. But I also think like that's something that we all should do sometime, is go out of our comfort zone and try. And what's wrong with trying?
Right. Yeah. Well, and of course, I had the personal connection. So it wasn't like I was just throwing, out what's the right metaphor? Like it wasn't like a, shot in the dark completely.
Yeah.
All I can fall back on is these cliches about like, no reward without risk or whatever it is. And I think when you're in the creative field, right, you if you're not taking risks, if you're not challenging yourself, if you're not a little uncomfortable, you may not be making interesting work. I don't know. I just think there's for me, right, there's a little bit of discomfort that goes along with breaking new ground, at least for yourself, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
We'll talk about the process of making this film with Mark and what Mark sort of learned about himself during the process, and maybe what you learned.
It was really fun because we had sort of this two-part process, right? The interviews and then 2 days of shooting. But the shoot days were kind of like playing. And we went in with a plan, but I very much wanted Mark's input on like what we might be able to shoot to go along with this script that I'd written. And it was a very different way of working for him than anything else, right? Because he's used to getting a script and understanding the character and all of those things. And I was like, you're the character. So you already understand yourself. And, he saw what I wanted to include as far as the ideas and the stories that he was talking about. So we worked together to come up with some ideas. I mean, the way Mark has talked about it, the film was like a way for him to process and articulate his thoughts on acting, right? And where he is in his life in his 70s, and he can like look back on this career. It was, I think, kind of a nice opportunity for him to reflect. And I mean, thankfully, what I was interested in terms of because we had hours of stuff, right? And I edited this down to 14, 15 minutes, 16 minutes maybe with credits. He feels like the film captured that. So that's a win for me as far as I'm concerned, that we both kind of aligned with the content. But yeah, I think it was the big reason why it worked and why he was so engaged was because of the opportunity to reflect that this gave him.
Because you mentioned that he's, a typecast actor. Did that sort of come out in the film where, how it feels to be typecast as an artist?
I hope so. Yes. That's the centerpiece of the film. And to kind of put that out there, explain how and why that happened and how he kind of let it happen or went along with it. And then to kind of break that down. And to sort of like see beneath the surface, right? In film, we're looking at the surface and trying to, we hope that the surface reveals something more profound, right? But for actors and the roles that they get, there's a different kind of limitation, I guess.
Yeah. And I wonder if he mentions about, maybe it feeling like almost a rejection in its own sense when you are the same character. They want you to be that same character all the time.
I said, I made this because I was interested in actors and wanting to learn more about their experience. But anytime we're talking about actors, right, we're looking at this kind of crucible for the human experience. And what they go through, I think, is applicable or generalizable to what any human goes through, as far as like how perceptions of us, other people's perceptions start to define or impact us, right, and the way we move through the world, on lots of different scales, right? We can talk about, how that affects people emotionally, but also physically, right? And so that was like kind of another aspect of this.
So before we go, we're running out of time here. I would like you to talk about, you obviously have some love for the Ann Arbor Film Festival. Talk about why people should come check it out, why it's the place to be, and come in person and just be a lover of films and really get to know experimental films, because sometimes they're not as off the wall as you might think they're going to be. You really can connect with them.
Yeah, I think I don't know, it's easy to get kind of intimidated maybe, or it's like, well, I don't know what this stuff is about, but it's, I think it's like, in my experience, experimental film is like so accessible because you can just go in without, you go in without expectations, right? Most of them are short. And I mean, I love the shorts program for kind of like the variety of what you can experience. And it's just, I mean, as you said in your introduction, right? It's refreshing, right? To experience film and video in this way that we rarely get to, right? And this is a form that is not really supported by the current sort of media consolidation and streaming and all of that, the way with like binge watching and all of that. You really, unfortunately, have to seek it out. But it's so, I don't know, I think it's like invigorating. I think it's entertaining. I think, I mean, as a filmmaker, it makes me feel more alive to see this work. And it's just such a special thing that we have that in Ann Arbor and so many filmmakers coming in person. The fact that it's in person this year and the timing seems to be lining up with kind of how COVID is shifting. It's also just such a wonderful opportunity kind of for people who haven't maybe ventured back into the theater. The time is now, come join us.
It really does open your mind to, even just as a viewer, it opens your mind to the possibility of so much more, I think.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. Art isn't just something that hangs on the wall, right? It's something that can live and move in front of us, right?
well,
And again, like with the filmmakers who are in attendance, right? We have these chances for talking with people, Q&As, panels around the festival. So
yeah, I like that you mentioned that too, because I think like a lot of times when I watch something that really speaks to me, I want to know more and I try to like look up more stuff and just get more information. And I think that this is like the perfect, when you can talk to a filmmaker about it, there's nothing better. You're going to get all your answers.
right. Yes. Yeah. And, oftentimes the filmmaker is as interested in what you think and what you felt, right? As anything they might have to say themselves, right? And that's part of the experience of watching this kind of work, right? Or experiencing this kind of work is like connecting with how you're responding to something. It's like back to the feeling alive thing.
Well, I want to thank you, Vera, for being on the show. It was really a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks for having me.
To watch this and other series on CTN, visit youtube.com/CTN Ann Arbor. And remember to like, subscribe, and share. I'm Dana Denhoff for Let's Watch with the Ann Arbor Film Festival.